I think we're going to go right into Brother Jason Richards. Brother Jason, are you there?
Yeah, I'm good to go.
All right. So I hope John is on. All right. Yeah, I see John. Cool. Good to see you, buddy. I see your name. Anyway, Jason, go ahead. And I think we're good. It's recording. Everybody online can hear you. So go ahead and screen share. Hey, John, with your crab. I was going to say your crabs. That sounds terrible. He's out. He's out. He bought a bunch of crabs. It's Crab Fest.
Thanks, Robert.
You're good to go.
All right, thanks, Robert. Yeah, so I was super stoked that Robert thought of me to give one of the presentations here at MasonicCon Chicago, and it was really, really interesting. I was really excited until I got my swag in the mail, and I took a look at the schedule of events, and I had some very pointed language for Robert when I found out that I was not only going right beside Maribel, but I was the following act, because I don't care who you are, that presentation is the best thing you're going to see all weekend. That said, it's my presentation follows very much a similar vein. So I'll start sharing the slides, and then we can just talk a little bit about what's really personal to me, because it's one of my first main journeys into Masonic research. And so this really started back about 7 or 8 years ago, when I was a newly minted Master Mason. And I was talking to a fellow, a district deputy grand master, someone else in my lodge, after a Master Mason degree, and they said something that just completely shocked me as a brand new Master Mason, and that was something to the effect of, Jason, it's really interesting, but the modern third degree myth, as we know it, isn't the original one. The original third degree myth was based around the character of Noah. And then he politely excused himself after dropping that knowledge bomb on me and walked away. And so from that standpoint, that shook me to my very core as a young Master Mason, because the 3 degrees of Masonry were all I had ever known. And as far as I was concerned, those 3 degrees had always been there since 1717. And realizing that might not be the case, and that the history of our really esteemed fraternity might be a little bit more nebulous and a little bit more nuanced than we realized, really was just kind of it just awoke the spark of Masonic research in me. So this presentation, I've been updating it for the past 7 years, and I never give it the same way twice. So we'll go into just a little bit about who Noah was, the character of Noah, the worldwide flood mythology, and then we'll bring it back around to what does Noah mean for Masonry? What did he mean for the craft guild system? What does he mean for Masonry today? And we'll wrap it up. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit just about Masonry in general. So I love throwing this particular quote up, because I think it's just such a trite as it is. Anybody who's read Dan Brown or knows anything about Freemasonry has seen this particular quote: "Freemasonry is a peculiar system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols." And they're like, yeah, you saw that on Dan Brown, but it's just such an amazing elevator speech for Freemasonry. The idea that as Freemasons, we are here to take good men and make them better, using a system of morality, and a very specific or peculiar system of morality. But in order to do so, we don't just hit people over the head with the 7 Noahide laws, or going back to Hammurabi, or we don't have a specific codified set of behaviors. Instead, we have a mystery play or an allegory that unfolds across the 3 degrees that encourages the the initiate and the candidate to seek the deeper meaning behind the allegorical significance, to divine those desired behaviors in that system of morality for himself. And in doing so, we place way markers, kind of like trailheads as you're hiking, to guide the initiate through that process. And those way markers are the symbols that we use in each of the degrees. So when you look at this, uh, this description of Freemasonry, it's just incredibly nuanced, and it's just so much more below the surface than it is above the surface. And I include this in this presentation because veiled in allegory and myth are just central to the initiatic experience of Freemasonry. We'll talk a little bit more about that in another slide, but let's start by just defining the battle space here. Like what is the lexicon that we're using between myth and allegory? And I like to bring this into the discussion just so that we're all on the same page with the key terminology. So a myth is really a traditional story. It is inherently an anthropological story concerning history of people or natural phenomenon, but it involves supernatural beings or events. And it comes from the Greek root mythos, which is word, tale, or narrative. And this is interesting because myth today has a connotation of being fantasy or made up. Say, oh, that's a myth, that's an old wives' tale, or something along those lines. And when you look at the actual Greek root of the word, there's no judgment on the veracity or validity of the story. It's just a traditional story that involves the supernatural. And allegory is similar. It's a story, poem, or picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning. And that's incredibly important because my argument is that if you look at the word mio, to teach, which is another.
Jason,
Yes. Yes.
we actually got dropped off here, so I'm wondering if you could go back 2 slides, if people wouldn't mind.
Absolutely. So yeah, just feel free to interrupt me if I drop off on the audio. I apologize for that. So taking a look at this particular quote, it's just absolutely incredible as far as its rich description and its accurate description of Freemasonry. So Freemasonry is a system of morality. We take good men and we make them better through a specific system of morality as communicated through the allegorical construct of the degrees. So we don't take the candidate and make him read 10,000 pages of laws, or or read Hammurabi's tablet, or make him recite the 7 Noahide laws by memory. Instead, we teach a system of morality and desired behaviors through allegory and through the deeper meaning behind the allegories as conveyed throughout the 3 degrees. And while the candidate is doing that allegorical inspection, we place way markers along the way to guide him through his journey to enlightenment. And those way markers are the symbols that we use to illustrate the degrees. So I know this particular quote is rather trite on the surface because anybody who's read Dan Brown or anybody who knows anything about Freemasonry has come across this quote. I really think it's the perfect elevator speech for Freemasonry in general. And I put this in this presentation because allegory and myth are just central to the initiatic experience that is Freemasonry. So, looking at the lexicon, I want to make sure everybody's on the same page with the key terminology. So, when we talk about myth, we're actually talking about a traditional story. It's an inherently anthropological story. It concerns history of a people or natural phenomenon, and it involves supernatural beings or events. So that addition of the supernatural makes that story and that oral tradition and turns it into a myth. Interestingly enough, missing from this uh, description or this definition of myth is any connotation relating the validity of those events. It's something that's come up more recently, where we say, "Oh, that's just a myth. That's just an old wives' tale," and we say we almost equate a myth to something that's fantasy or made up. But if you look at the Greek words or the Greek roots, mythos and mio, word, tale, and true narrative, uh, there's not that inherent validity or non-validity judgment attached to the story. Um, Allegory is similar. It's a story, poem, or picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning. And the importance here is that I use myth and allegory rather coterminously, because if you look at the second root for myth, mio, it means to teach. And it's been interpreted by Homer as to initiate into the mysteries. So when you look at mythologies across the world and oral traditions involving supernatural phenomenon, um, you can see where Homer looked at these mythologies as a way to initiate small groups of people, only the ones who could see past the literal interpretation, into the greater mysteries of God and the universe. And so mythology and allegory are both critical to the Masonic experience. So let's talk about the modern Masonic myth. The modern Masonic myth, of course, revolves around the building of King Solomon's temple, and we use the passion play of the fallen builder to instill desired behaviors of fidelity, of truthfulness, and of holding on to the end, uh, as a model of desired behavior for our candidates. And that's how we take good men and make them better. Um, and so, it's, the third degree specifically is really the capstone of Blue Lodge Masonry. And I like to say, whenever, Grand Lodge officers tell you, oh, there are no innovations in Masonry, just point them back to the third degree, because the craft guilds didn't actually have that. And the third degree really didn't come on the scene until the early 1700s. And so I like uh, to bristle folks by saying the third degree is actually the original innovation in masonry. But the historical evidence exists that the modern Masonic myth, that's the capstone of Blue Lodge Freemasonry as we know it today, was not the only one that was used in the early 1700s. We have historical evidence that exists that the story and person of Noah were used as an early iteration of a third degree ritual. So what I'd like to do now is step through the history of the Noahide myth, and just take a look at the similarities between the Noahide flood myth and really flood mythology across the world to our own initiatic experience as Masons, and then we can step through that and see why it might have been an attractive story to use for our forefathers who are building this capstone to Blue Lodge Masonry. So, a quick note about oral traditions and dates. I have tried my best to ascribe dates to each of these oral traditions that we're going to step through. And the date is not the date in which we believe these oral traditions began. As historians and anthropologists, we have no way of knowing that, because oral traditions are like a long, really bad game of telephone. that stretch over tens of thousands, if not more, years. So when I ascribe a date to a particular oral tradition, that is the date, as best as historians can tell, that tradition was actually written down and encoded in language, because the only way you can actually tell how an oral tradition has been changed is by taking a look at those snapshots in time, which are the different written versions of these oral traditions. And we'll see this a little bit in the Sumerian and Akkadian texts shortly. But let's get into a survey of flood mythology. I like to spice it up by saying worldwide tales of aqueous destruction and redemption. And as we step through these pieces of flood mythology, what I'd like you to do is keep a keen eye out for similarities, because we're going to be talking about the similarities that might be there a little bit later, but keep an eye out for certain motifs that might be relevant to our Masonic experience. But first, yes, there's more, but wait, there's more. We're going to watch just a little video to open us up to this this particular point of view.
Hello, Aziraphale. Everybody. So, giving the mortals a flaming sword, how would that work out for you? The Almighty has never actually mentioned it again. Probably a good thing. What's all this about? Build a big boat and fill it with a travelling zoo? From what I hear, God's a bit touchy. Wiping out the human race. Big storm. All of them. Just the locals. I don't believe the Almighty's upset with the Chinese, or the Native Americans, or the Australians. Yet, and God's not actually going to wipe out all the locals. Noah, up there, his family, his sons, their wives, they're all going to be fine. But they're drowning everybody else. Not the kids. You can't kill kids. Well, that's more the kind of thing you'd expect my lot to do. Yes, but when it's done, the Almighty's going to put up a new thing called a rainbow, as a promise not to drown everyone again. How kind.
And so, that's one of my favorite stories on Amazon. It's Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett's Good Omens. And as I flip back to the slides, it just really sets the stage for flood mythology, because human beings are all about trying to ascribe meaning to natural events. If there's a catastrophe, something had to have been the cause of it, because human beings are very, very bad about dwelling with uncertainty. And so the natural response of humans, and we're even seeing this with with conspiracy theories about COVID-19 and things like that, is humans want to make sure that they ascribe a meaning to it so that it doesn't happen again. And so as you think about these different pieces of mythology, think about what must be going on in the minds of the folks who are communicating these oral traditions generation after generation after generation. So let's get to arguably the most well-known of the flood mythologies. This, of course, is the story of Noah's flood, and it unfolds in the Abrahamic myth that's told in Genesis chapter 6 to 9. Again, the date of 950 to 500 BC is not when the oral tradition began, or when we even think a flood-like event happened. These are the dates when scholars in three distinct camps actually believe that the Old Testament was actually first encoded and first written down. So the story unfolds like this. Man falls out of favor with God because man is exceedingly wicked. And in all the earth, God can only find one faithful servant, and that is Noah, and along with his wife, his sons, and their wives. And so God goes to Noah and tells him to build an ark and bring animals into the ark, because God is going to destroy the entire world by flood, and kind of do a bit of a reboot. So Noah does as he is commanded. He brings animals into the ark. Um, the floods come down, or come up, depending on the part of the story that you're listening most to, and the entire world is destroyed. After the waters recede, of course, Noah releases several birds, doves, ravens, etc. And when the birds do not return, Noah knows that the waters have receded. They proceed forth from the ark, and Noah offers a burnt offering to the Lord, to God, the Creator who saved them from the flood. And God makes a new covenant with man at that point, sealed by a rainbow in the sky. That he promises never to drown anyone again, as Michael Sheen says in Good Omens. So it's really interesting, because if you dive really deeply into anything in the Old Testament, you realize the Old Testament is really just a collection of oral traditions, and as such, there are some internal inconsistencies throughout the narrative, both in the Genesis account of the flood, but also in the Genesis creation story. And I like to point this out because when you take a look at internally inconsistent oral traditions, it just throws stopping at a literal perspective on the story just out the window. Because if you have an internally inconsistent narrative, you have to look deeper to the deeper allegorical significations of the lessons. And so my goal for you all is to really open your minds a little bit and start exploring beneath the surface and just not taking everything literally. And so in the story of the Great Flood specifically, we see that this is actually two separate oral traditions that the author of Genesis has actually smashed together. And what I mean by that is there are several contradictions in Genesis. You could take Genesis chapter 6, verses 19 through 20, 7 verse 9, and 7 verse 15, and say, well, the animals entered the ark 2 by 2. Or you could take a look at Genesis chapter 7, verses 2 and 3, and you can say, oh, the animals entered the ark 2 by 2, but then also there were 7 of each of the clean types of animals. When you look at how the flood came to be, you have two different tellings. In 7 verses 4 and 7 verses 12, rain came down and flooded the earth. But in 7 verse 10, the waters of the flood broke forth from the earth itself. Noah and his family actually enter the ark at two different points, in chapter 7 verse 7, as well as chapter 7 verse 13. And then you have in 7 verses 11 and 8 verse 13, you have the flood lasting 1 year. Or in 7 verse 17, you have the flood actually lasting 40 days. And the 40 days piece is actually another clue that this is meant to be taken allegorically, because 40 days is, if you look at sacred numerology, 40 days is actually used a number of times in the Bible, as well as the number 7, to denote completion and perfection. So it's just the differences in this narrative really emphasize the fact that we have to look deeper, and we can't just stop with a literal interpretation of the events, regardless of what may have actually happened. So from that standpoint, let's talk about the oldest extant accounts of a catastrophic flood. And in order to do that, we have to go to the Akkadian, Sumerian, and Babylonian flood accounts, starting with the tablet on the right here, 1700, written about 1700 years before the Common Era. And no, this is not the Epic of Gilgamesh. We know that the Epic of Gilgamesh does contain a story of the catastrophic flood, but the Epic of Gilgamesh is actually over here, written about 1300 years before the Common Era. And that's because the Epic of Gilgamesh, while it is widely known as the oldest written story and epic, written about 2,000 years before the Common Era, you know, rather anthropologists have been able to find, and archaeologists have been able to find various snapshots and various different retellings of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And we found that the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the version that contains the flood story, wasn't actually written until hundreds of years after the oldest written version. So that's why we have 13 years before the Common Era on there, because the oldest version of the Epic of Gilgamesh does not contain that flood story. So moving back over to the right here, 1700 years before the Common Era, we have the Atrahasis epic, which tablet 3 of which contains the flood story, which really became the foundation for the flood story in the Eridu Genesis in the middle, as well as the later version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so the Atrahasis epic flood story unfolds somewhat like this. The gods create human beings to do all the work on earth. After a while, the humans become numerous and noisy. They're fruitful and they multiply. And that noise disturbs the rest of the gods. So Enlil, who is the king of the gods, plots to send a devastating flood to wipe out all of humanity. This doesn't sit well with Enki, who's another god who actually created the human beings in the first place. Enki takes pity on his servant, the kind and wise Atrahasis, whose name, by the way, means exceedingly wise, and warns him of a coming flood, telling him to build an ark and seal 2 of every kind of animal within. Atrahasis enters the ark with his family and the animals, and after 7 days, again, paying attention to sacred numerology here, the flood ends and the waters subside. At this point in time, Enlil and the other gods are wondering why they haven't been brought any food, because the humans do all of the farming and they do all of the work for the gods. They realize their mistake because they're hungry and they don't have their labor force anymore. At this point in time, Atrahasis comes out of the ark and makes a burnt offering to the gods. The gods bring Enki before them and demand that he explain himself. And then the gods eat Atrahasis's sacrifice. And Enki then proposes a new solution to prevent overpopulation, a new covenant, as it were. And this is where the gods create the ideas of celibacy, infertility, and infant mortality, to put an artificial cap on population growth. And so Atrahasis is then, of course, carried away to paradise to live apart from the new race of humans. The Sumerian creation story, the Eridu Genesis, seems to have been taken, almost wholesale from the Atrahasis epic. The main difference is that the protagonist in the Eridu Genesis, again in the tablet in the middle here, is Zisudra, who is an enlightened king and priest. And then we get to the left, which finally is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And again, the version of the Epic of Gilgamesh that we found that actually contains the flood story has been dated to about 1300 years, before the Common Era, and it revolves around. It's really just kind of an aside. It's kind of a side story, because Gilgamesh loses his best friend. And he gets obsessed with the realities of his own mortality. and this sends him into a spiraling depression. So Gilgamesh seeks out Utnapishtim, who was the protagonist and of the Epic of Gilgamesh flood story. And again, there are a ton of similarities between Utnapishtim's story and the Atrahasis epic. You have you know Utnapishtim, who is tasked by Enki to build a ship called the Preserver of Life. He's tasked with bringing his wife, family, and relatives, as well as grains and baby animals along with him. After 12 days on the water, Utnapishtim opened the hatch of the ship to look around and rested his ship on the slopes of Mount Nasir for 7 days, getting into that sacred numerology again. On the seventh day, he sent out a dove to see if the water had receded, but the dove returned. He then sent out a swallow, and the swallow returned. And then finally, Utnapishtim sent out a raven, and the raven saw that the waters had receded. It circled around and did not return. Utnapishtim then set all of the animals free and made a sacrifice to the gods. The gods came, and Utnapishtim and his wife were spirited away to the ethereal plane, where they lived as part of the gods. So let's get into some of the other newer accounts across the world. So if we look at at the if we look at the Satapatha Brahmana in Hindu mythology, we see the story of Manu, who is the first man, who is visited by an avatar of Vishnu and warned of an impending flood. Vishnu appears to him as a small fish, and Manu takes pity on Vishnu. He sees that the fish is in danger, so Manu saves the fish from danger. The fish grows and grows and grows over time and returns to Manu and says, "Because you did me this kindness, I'm going to save you from an impending flood." And so Vishnu predicted that the world would come to an end by a huge flood in how many days? 7 days, and requested that Manu build a huge boat and take, again, 7 sages or hermits, 4 worlds, seeds of all plants, and 1 animal of each type with him. And Vishnu told Manu that Vishnu would appear as a giant fish and save them from the floods. So Manu did as he was commanded. He took everybody with him, and when the floods came, Vishnu appeared as this giant fish that you can see in the graphic here. Manu tethered the boat to the horn sticking out of Vishnu, and Vishnu carried Manu and his companions and the animals and seeds and everything to safety. So looking at the Greek and Roman accounts, again, written between about 200 years before the Common Era, crossing over the BC AD changeover to about 200 years Common Era, we see the Bibliotheca account of Deucalion, written about the 2nd century Common Era by Pseudo-Apollodorus. We say Pseudo-Apollodorus because we don't actually know who wrote the Bibliotheca. And Ovid's Metamorphoses as well, in about 8 years Common Era. And the Romans just borrowed absolutely everything except for names from the Greeks. So I'm going to tell one story, and it's really the same for both the Roman and Greek accounts. The first men created by the god Prometheus were known as the Pelasgians, and they were exceedingly wicked. So Lucian, who is the king of Arcadia, wished to test the omniscience of Zeus by offering him a burnt offering made from Lycaon's own son as a human sacrifice. Of course, this was abhorrent to the gods. And so Zeus, in response, went into a rage and sent a flood to destroy the men of the Bronze Age. But as we learned in Maribel's presentation just a little while ago, Prometheus took pity on the humans and warned Deucalion about the pending flood and instructed him to build a chest. The floods came, and all other men perished, and Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, after floating in the chest for 9 days and nights, landed on Parnassus. And when the rain ceased, Deucalion sacrificed to Zeus. And at the bidding of Zeus, and this is where this graphic comes in, Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha exited the chest and began walking away, and they threw stones over their heads as they did so. And the stones that Deucalion threw over his head became the new race of men, and the stones that Pyrrha threw over her head became the new race of women. So moving forward, crossing the Atlantic Ocean, we see there are, the same stories or similar oral traditions exist in Mesoamerica and in the Americas. Starting with the Aztec tradition, which tells of a man named Tapi who lived a long time ago, and he was a pious and righteous man. The creator told Tapi to build a boat that he expected Tapi to live in. He was told that he should take his wife and a pair of every animal that was alive into that boat. Naturally, everyone thought he was crazy, but the flood soon came down, and everybody perished except for Tapi, his wife, and the animals that were in the boat. The rain finally ended, and Tapi realized that the water had finally receded and dried up when he let a dove loose that did not return. Moving a little bit further south into the mountainous region of the Andes, we come across some mythologies from the Incan tradition. So this tells of a story of during the time called the Pachacama, people became very evil. They were so obsessed about being evil and coming up with evil deeds to do that they neglected the gods. And only those high up in the Andes remained uncorrupted. So two brothers who lived in the highlands noticed that their llamas were acting rather strangely. They asked the llamas why, and they were told that the stars had told the llamas that a great flood was coming and the flood would destroy all life on Earth. So the brothers took their families, they took their llamas and their other flocks into a cave in the high mountains, and it started to rain and continued raining for 4 months. As the waters rose and threatened to flood the mountain cave, something amazing happened. The mountains started growing to outpace the rising waters of the floods. When the waters finally receded, the mountains dropped back down to their original height. At that point in time, the shepherds came out and repopulated the earth. But the llamas remembered the flood. And that, to this day, is why you really only find llamas in the highland areas. And so llamas prefer to live in the highland areas just in case a flood comes in again. So moving over back across the Atlantic to the continent of Africa, you realize Africa is very much an interesting case when it comes to oral traditions concerning a catastrophic flood, because there aren't a lot that are indigenous to the continent of Africa. So, excuse me, by and large, most of the flood stories that you hear coming out of Africa are the Abrahamic myth, and that is largely due to the British colonialism period of the 1800s, where the British sent missionaries and others into the African continent to explore and spread the good news of the gospel. And so, but what you do find here and there are scattered oral traditions that tell not necessarily a catastrophic global flood story, but more of a localized catastrophic flood story. And you can see that in places like Nigeria, but also in Cameroon. The story in Cameroon revolves around a small girl and her brother who were in their home after everyone had gone to tend to their farms. The girl began grinding flour when a goat came to eat it, walked into the house and started eating it. The girl shooed away the goat, and the goat came back a second time, and the girl took pity on the goat and let the goat eat as much flour as the goat wanted to. At this point in time, goat spoke to her and told her that in return for her kindness, he would warn her of an imminent flood. So the girl and her brother gathered up their things and fled the village. And they looked behind them to see the entire village collapsing under a wall of water. The girl and her brother lived by themselves for years and years and years, wondering if any human beings had ever actually survived that flood event. Excuse me. And at this point in time, the goat came back and gave the brother and sister permission to marry each other so that they could repopulate the area. And so, it's an interesting take. It has a lot of similarities to to some of the other flood stories. But again, as we're seeing as we're looking at these different oral traditions and mythologies, you realize that each one is kind of similar, but it's also been tailored and heavily tailored to the actual, the people and the environment and the culture. And so we just see these mythological commonalities coming into play just throughout time and space among cultures that should have never been in contact with each other. So anthropologists have found an estimated 500 different oral traditions involving a catastrophic flood from every single continent except for Antarctica, because nobody lives there, at least now. And a lot of those, mythologies deal with an initial human transgression, different motifs. There's the salvation of an enlightened few. There's destruction by water, or in some cases, like Finland and Norse mythology, there's destruction by blood. You have a new covenant with God, and then a repopulation of the area and the world. And so my question is, over the course of these 500 different oral traditions, again, separated by tens of thousands of years and tens of thousands of miles, why do these common motifs exist? And to me, that points to, at some point in time, a large event or a large subset or a collection of events. And it points to the distinct probability of a common oral tradition. And while that oral tradition, might have arisen out of the aftermath of a global catastrophic event, Manly P. Hall, Plato, and Ignatius Donnelly have surmised that the deluge myth actually has its origins in the lost continent of Atlantis. And so the lost continent of Atlantis is said to have been ruled over by Poseidon. The land was divided into 10 concentric zones, and each zone was ruled over by one of Poseidon's offspring, and the offspring here flourished. They mastered all of the crafts, and they became the pinnacle of society on Earth. But they got greedy, and they decided to go to war, because they weren't content just to rule over Atlantis. They wanted to rule over the entire world. And so Zeus gathered together the gods and addressed them. And this is where Plato's narrative ends. But Marcellus picks up the narrative with violent earthquakes and floods that sank Atlantis in one day, and the entire world as we knew it was destroyed by water. So this is a really interesting story. But let's look to the science, and let's see if there might be a scientific explanation for all of these oral traditions. And that's where we need to look at the geomorphological evidence. And so geomorphology is a scientific study of topographic features. Essentially, why does the Earth look the way it looks? Why do we have the Grand Canyon? Why do we have the Marianas Trench? Why do we have the mountain ranges? What is the topography of the Earth, and how has it changed, and what are the reasons for those changes? And so if we look back at the height of the last ice age, that was the maximum interglacial, which was about 20,000 years ago. According to the USGS, or the United States Geological Survey, permanent summer ice covered about 8% of the Earth's surface and about 25% of the land area during the maximum interglacial. And that was a total of 6 billion cubic meters of glacial ice. So if you look down here, you can actually see the variation in the core temperature, and scientists are actually able to tell this because they've been able to go to Greenland and other places and drill huge cores of ice that and these cylinders of ice or cores of ice actually tell the story of the past, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years of the Earth's climate change history. So starting at about 15,000 years ago, you get an upswing in temperatures, and that starts to bring us out of the Pleistocene epoch or the last ice age into the current geological era that we're living in now, which is the Holocene epoch. But you have this period known as the Younger Dryas, where for about 12 to 1400 years, the Earth was plunged back into those ice age type of temperatures. And as Maribel mentioned, one of the theories surrounding the why the Younger Dryas actually happened is the theory that the Earth was actually struck by fragments of a comet or an asteroid that caused massive wildfires that blocked out the sun and cooled the Earth by as many as I think 10 degrees Celsius, and plunged us back into the ice age for about another 12 to 1400 years. At the end of the Younger Dryas, you can see the Earth warming up again to getting to the point where we really are in today's Holocene epoch. But the Younger Dryas period of about 12,000 years ago led to the Flandrian interglacial, which again ushered in the start of the current geological age. And this age was characterized by a rapid rise in sea levels that accompanied the melting of the ice sheets. It's interesting, though, geologists, again, using those ice cores in Greenland, have uncovered evidence that these major ice sheets that covered, all of Canada and most of the United States melted within 4,000 years. And that sounds like a lot of time, but when you're looking at billions of cubic meters of ice, that is a catastrophically quick time for those ice sheets to actually melt. So it was really, really interesting. When geologists started to look into theories of how this ice melted and melted so fast. You have the most accepted theory of how the North American glaciers melted, and that's the ice dam burst theory, and it describes a gradual and repeating bursting of glacial lakes in North America that eventually led to the loss of the North American ice cap. During the last deglaciation, numerous glacial lake outburst floods were caused by the collapse of ice sheets or glaciers that formed the dams of proglacial lakes. And these outburst floods could have accounted for massive regional flooding, not just in the Americas, but also through the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia and other places around the world. But interestingly enough, in 1927, geologist J. Harlan Bretz, who you can see here over on the left, shocked the world when he proposed the theory that the majority of the glacial ice was wiped out by a single catastrophic flood. And he formulated this theory. Again, this is something that Maribel touched on in the last presentation. He formulated this theory by years of study of the topography and topology of the United States. And where areas like the channeled scablands, and this picture in particular is a picture of the dry falls throughout the western United States, point to specific evidence of a catastrophic flood that would have come from a catastrophic breakdown and bursting of those glaciers. So geologists to this day, are split over the magnitude and the specific reasons how and why these ice sheets burst at the end of the last ice age, moving into the Flandrian interglacial. But we have evidence that, at least on a continental scale, there was massive widespread flooding that could have been the foundation for some of these oral traditions of a catastrophic flood. So I've been talking a whole lot about flood mythology, and you're probably wondering, what does any of this actually have to do with Freemasonry? And to do that, we have to take a look at the craft guild system, and we have to look at the history of the craft guild system in connection with the Noahide Flood Myth. And for this, we're going to go back to the mid 1300s to York, England, where there was a really, really interesting thing that happened at the Festival of Corpus Christi every year between the mid 1300s to the mid 1500s. And at the Festival of Corpus Christi, all of the craft guilds in York got together to perform mystery plays. And there were 48 mystery plays total. Each play was put on by a different guild. And we know from records that there were several guilds that performed the Noah story. The shipwrights performed a play on the building of the ark, and the fishers and mariners performed a play on Noah and his wife. Now, of course, the stonemasons were there, but they performed a play on the coming of the three kings to Herod, as opposed to anything relating to Noah. But this demonstrates that as many of the guildsmen were good Christians, Noah was a story that was well known to the craft guilds. Moving forward in getting into the old charges, especially in the constitutions of Freemasons, in Anderson's constitutions written in 1723, he talks about Noah and his sons being all Masons true. He also talks about the fact that a Mason is obliged by his tenure to observe the moral law. He even talks about Noah and his sons being masons and being builders, albeit with wood as opposed to stone. Again, at the earliest part of our written documentation relating to the speculative Masonic fraternity, we're seeing allusions to the character of Noah as having something to do with Masonry or being a part of the Masonic experience. But perhaps the most significant of the old charges that points to a Noahide legend of the third degree is in the Graham manuscript, which we believe was written about 1726. This is the first known account of a Masonic raising. It's the oldest extant account. And that is because it predates Pritchard's expose, Masonry Dissected, by 4 years. Samuel Pritchard, published really the first widespread Masonic exposure in 1730, which is the first actual detailing of the Hieronymic legend of the third degree. The Graham manuscript predates that by 4 years and it's a catechism question and answer. But at the end of the Graham manuscript, and if you go to oldcharges.com, you can take a look at this for yourself. It's really fascinating. At the end of the Graham manuscript, we actually see a long passage that bears striking similarities to our contemporary third degree legend. You have Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who journey to their father's grave, Noah's grave, after Noah has passed away, because Noah died in possession of a secret, of some sort of secret knowledge. And Shem, Ham, and Japheth are looking to gather that knowledge and obtain that knowledge. So there's a quest for what was lost. They find the grave of their father and they attempt to raise him up. They attempt to raise him from the dead by the finger, which falls off, by the wrist, and then by the elbow. When they are unable to raise their father those three ways, they pull his corpse up to their bodies and they match him up on 5 distinct points of the body. When they are unable to bring their father back to life, they cry out to God and they have an invocation of deity. They talk a little bit about their father's body. That the words which are used bear some similarities to some of the first instances of the Master's word. And then finally, they institute a substitute for that which was lost when they're unable to obtain the actual information itself, until such a time as they can actually find out the real thing. And so this is just a fascinating manuscript. It's the only one that we have that details a story of an attempted raising that is very, very, very eerily similar to the modern third degree myth and the modern third degree legend. And so this gives us, of course, our evidence that such a myth had been written. Well, we have a little bit more evidence, again, just scraps and fragments, that this mythology and this initiatic allegory was in use about the same time as Desaguliers' Hiramic legend. And that evidence comes from actually a mock advertisement that was published in about 1726, about the same year, I believe, as the Graham manuscript came into being. It's a mock advertisement to give notice to all Masons who have been made after the antediluvian manner, of course, alluding to the mythology and the passion play of Noah. And it talks about a lodge that's being held in England that is going to be showing what the innovations of the moderns have been doing, and relating specifically to the prominent modern myth and modern legend that we know of today. So it's very fascinating that this particular mock advertisement at least demonstrates that the two legends were used contemporaneously, and at this point in time, at the time of the Graham manuscript, again several years before Pritchard actually documented the Hiramic legend and sent it out to everybody, we see how the antediluvian legend was actually on its way out, and Desaguliers and his contemporaries were really pushing the Hiramic legend to be the capstone of Freemasonry. So it brings us to the question, why would the story of Noah have been used as a hallmark for speculative Masonry? And one of the reasons why is just the fact that if you look at the similarities across time and space with these flood traditions, flood mythology models the initiatic experience. You start with a corrupt and unenlightened state of man. You have that initial transgression of mankind. You then have a priest or protagonist searching for enlightenment. That's the candidate searching for that knowledge and that enlightenment. You have a cleansing initiation that washes away the old and brings in the new enlightened state post initiation that is sealed with a divine covenant between the enlightened individuals and the Creator, and all of the old is washed away, and there is nothing but new left. And this models the true secret of Freemasonry, which I believe is that initiatic experience. If you look at it from an alchemical context, And I will say without reservation, I stole this entire slide from our next speaker, Brother Tim Hogan. Because it's just a fascinating part of one of his books. When you look at the flood story, you can actually line up different pieces of flood stories to different pieces of the flood story to different stages of the alchemical process. And so the Earth stage is an antediluvian world obsessed with the material senses. You then have the water stage, excuse me, which is a cleansing initiatic flood that sweeps away the profane. In the air stage, or the distillation stage, you have a dove released post-deluge that, again, the distillation stage is supposed to capture the purities and separate the purities from the impurities. And so the dove, or the raven, or the bird, finding that the waters have receded is a sign that the old has truly been swept away and there's nothing but new left. And then finally, you have the fire stage, or the calcination stage, which is evidenced by the burnt offering upon exit from the ark. So not only do you have this great hero's journey of an initiatic experience unfolding from the character of Noah, but you have it in an alchemical context as well, which is very fascinating. So where does Noah exist today? Well, if you're in most of the Blue Lodges in the United States outside of Pennsylvania, you have these two symbols, the anchor and the ark. And they're two symbols at the end of the Master Mason degree, and they're symbols of a well-founded hope and a well-lived life. But that's really where the allusions to the story of Noah and the character of Noah stop in Blue Lodge Masonry. Good for us, though, Noah's found elsewhere, and specifically in the allied Masonic degrees with the commander of Noah and the commander Noah and the Royal Ark Mariner. This is where the person of Noah, and the allegory of the Noahide flood myth really come into its own with Freemasonry. You also have the Order of Rainbow for Girls, which Maribel talked about, and then there's also a degree in the Scottish Rite Southern jurisdiction, which talks a little bit about that as well. But just to wrap this up real quick, the myth of Noah clearly influenced the development of the third degree, or at least one piece of the third degree. Early craft masons were familiar with the tale, and honestly, Noah was an attractive allegorical model to model intangible desired behaviors. The story of the flood, moreover, models the initiatic experience, and that initiatic experience continues to be a central theme throughout speculative masonry. And ultimately, Desaguliers and others favored the building of King Solomon's Temple and the legend of the fallen builder to serve as the capstone of craft masonry. And of course, this probably came down to two things. One, Noah, while Anderson mentions he's a mason, he wasn't a builder in stone. He was a builder in gopher wood. And so the building of King Solomon's Temple was likely more appropriate and more easily relatable to stonemasons. And then two, Desaguliers, as a member of the Royal Society and as the third Grand Master of the Premier Grand Lodge of England, it really probably came down to very much a popularity contest. And his work in the Royal Society, as well as his work in the British aristocracy and the Premier Grand Lodge of England, made it just much more likely that the Hieronymic legend would win out over the Noahide legend. And so I really appreciate you all sticking with me and bearing with me. I know we've gone long, but I appreciate it. And we'll go ahead and we'll stop there. And Robert, I'm happy to answer any questions you've got, or if we need to move on, just show's yours.
So for anybody who is online, feel free to submit them in the Q&A. But for the room, we've got a mic today. So if you have a question, just stand up and use this mic.
Brother Richards, thank you. Was there any indication in your research which of the allegories preceded the other? If there was any solid facts that the Noahide one preceded the Hieronymic one, or vice versa?
So, yeah, we don't know as historians. It's if you take a look at that mock advertisement, you get the antediluvian Masonic side of the story, which was, hey, we were here first, and Desaguliers and his cronies are and the other moderns are providing innovations, and they're injecting innovations into the original mythology. So if you side on the side of the antediluvian Masons, then the antediluvian legend came first. But from a matter of historical record, we don't know. If you're looking at just what's published, we have to take some guesses, and we've been able to. Again, it's all about we can't date the oral traditions, so we have to look at when they were written down. And so the Graham manuscript was written down 4 years before the Pritchard's Masonry dissected. So from a strict historical context, the oldest record points to the antediluvian Masonic myth. But I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg.
Great presentation. I actually just want to make a comment that I think is worth pointing out that might be kind of a hangover from some of what you're talking about. And this has to do with within the Blue Lodge itself. We often forget that our officers, some of our officers are stewards and wardens, which are ship officers. And we also make use of a cable tow, which is what ties a ship to shore. So some of that may be hangover or tie-overs from this earlier Noah tradition, because it certainly ties in more to a boat than it does to cutting stone. So that's it. I just want to make that comment. But great presentation.
Thank you. That's fascinating, and I didn't know that. So I've got my pen out, and I'm taking notes because I always learn so much from folks every time I give this presentation.
Jason, I have an online question. Outside of the third degree, are there any Masonic lessons, teachings we could be missing by not having the Royal Ark Mariner degrees as popular as they used to be?
Oh, that's a really good question, and honestly, I think just about every the Royal Ark Mariner degree is not the antediluvian Masonic myth. So they're two completely different stories. They tell completely different lessons. Don't make don't enter into the trap of conflating the two, because they're very different. I think their different degrees teach different lessons. That's why we've got the Allied Masonic degrees. The Allied Masonic degrees were put together to preserve these degrees that just lost the popularity contest in England and elsewhere. So there always is any number of lessons that we can learn from initiatory rites and degree systems.
Well, Brother Richards, very good presentation. Nick said a question about, you guys on the Masonic Roundtable had a great, recap of some of the exposés throughout history on Masonry. And I've heard about the Noahide kind of legends before, but, it's one of those things where we talk about floods, but we don't talk about the fact that Noah died 300 years after the floods when he was ripe old age of 950 years old, laying uncovered in the fields in his vineyards, drunk on wine. But do we have any tell-alls from that time or any inkling about what the real story was and if his sons had anything to do with it? Because I just can't imagine that whatever the Masonic experience was back then actually had to deal a lot with the flood. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's kind of the rub. The only document that we have that actually tells the oral tradition of an antediluvian Masonic legend is the Grand Manuscript. And so we just don't have anything else that actually details what that particular mythology was about. And so, yeah, the character of Noah is even of a tertiary concern in the antediluvian Masonic allegory. It's really his sons are the ones who are actually going and searching for the knowledge. And we don't have any idea on how Noah died. We don't have any idea whether the allegory made his death from natural causes, or whether he was actually slain, in with the modern legend. And so we just, as historians, we have very, very little to go on as far as antediluvian masonry is concerned. So that's lots of flowery language to say I've got no idea, and we likely will never know.
Brother Jason, thank you so much. For everybody listening, I do this bad habit of not introducing people, but I'll say it's kind of like maybe biblical text. After you read the whole book, then you find out who the gospel was by. So this has been the gospel according to Jason Richards. I want to let you guys know that he's a past master of Acacia Lodge. He was raised back in 2012. He's one of our writers in the past on the Midnight Freemasons blog. He had his own blog for a little while. I wish he would start back up, Jason. He has some great perspectives, and you can catch him every week on the Masonic Roundtable, which is a podcast and a video cast, which goes live on Google, and you can find it on Facebook as well. Jason, is there anything else you'd want to mention? Any plugs? Anything? Anywhere else people can find you in the next few months, maybe online or anything?
Masonic Roundtable, and I've got a writer's page on Facebook, jasonm.richards. And I love writing, but it takes so much time, and I have so little time right now. So maybe one day I'll get back into it, but I also do a fair bit of editing. But this has been an awesome event, Robert, so thank you so much for doing this, because it's fantastic.
Thank you so much, Jason. For everybody watching live, we're going to take 10 minutes. We'll be back here at 11:10 Central, and make sure you get back here, because we're going to have Brother Timothy Hogan talk about some amazing Templar connections in Freemasonry, stuff you might not know. All right, we'll see you in a few.